Two of the most important names in the history of hip-hop were never invented. They were borrowed. Ice-T, Ice Cube. Both of them took their names, directly and on purpose, from one real man, a man neither of them ever met, who was already dead before either name became famous around the world. His real name was Robert Beck. Before anyone called him a writer, he spent 24 years as a pimp in Chicago. By his own count, more than 400 women worked for him over that span. He went to prison more than once. And then, in his late 40s, he sat down and wrote a book that made him the best-selling black author in America. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. That book reshaped an entire genre of American music before the genre existed. And the man who wrote it died broke in a one-room apartment with barely running water, exploited by his own publisher, and the world didn't find out he was gone for weeks, because he died the exact same week Los Angeles erupted into riots. This is the real story behind two names you already know. Robert Beck was born in Chicago in 1918. In his own later writing, he credited his mother directly for not abandoning him. He described her choosing not to leave him in a dumpster as an infant, a detail he returned to more than once across his books. He was genuinely intelligent, briefly enrolled at the Tuskegee Institute, the historically black university, before dropping out and returning to the streets of Chicago's South Side. By 18, he'd entered the life that would define the next 24 years, pimping across multiple Midwestern cities, eventually running an operation his own memoir describes as reaching more than 400 women across his career. It's worth understanding what pushed a briefly college-enrolled young man toward that specific path, since it wasn't presented, even in his own telling, as an obvious or inevitable choice. Chicago's South Side in the 1930s offered a young black man leaving the formal education system very few paths toward the kind of financial independence and respect he was chasing. The world of organized street hustling wasn't glamorous in the way film would later render it. It was one of a narrow set of options available to someone determined not to accept the limits the rest of society had already decided for him. That doesn't excuse what followed. It contextualizes why a genuinely intelligent young man ended up choosing it in the first place. He earned the name that would follow him for the rest of his life during that period. 6'3", lean, and known for a cold, controlled temperament in situations that made other men panic. Iceberg Slim. The name itself is worth understanding as more than a nickname. In the world he operated in, a reputation like that functioned as actual protection. A man known to stay calm under pressure, who didn't panic and didn't overreact, was a man other people were less likely to test. He cultivated that image deliberately, the same way he'd later describe cultivating every other part of the persona that kept him alive and in control for over 2 decades on streets that killed or imprisoned most of the men who tried to do what he did. Treat the specific details of that period, the exact numbers, the specific methods of control his memoir describes, including violence, as his own account, from a book explicitly written and marketed as a warts-and-all confession. It's worth being direct about this. His own writing describes real cruelty toward the women who worked for him, not just toward himself. This isn't a redemption story that skips that part. It's worth being precise about why that distinction matters for how this whole story should be understood. Some retellings of Iceberg Slim's life skip quickly past this part, treating the pimping years as a rough backstory on the way to the more comfortable story of literary redemption. His own writing doesn't allow for that shortcut. He described the psychological manipulation, the violence, and the control tactics in explicit detail by his own choice, because the entire value of his later work depended on refusing to sanitize what he'd actually done. A whitewashed version of those 24 years wouldn't have been honest, and honesty was the one thing his writing career was actually built on. Beck served multiple jail terms across his years in the life. A 10-month stint in 1960 became the turning point he later described as genuinely changing him, not an instant transformation, but the beginning of an exit that took years to complete. By his 40s, he was done. He walked away from pimping entirely, and in 1967, already in his late 40s, an age most first-time authors would consider late to begin, he published Pimp, The Story of My Life. The gap between deciding to leave and actually publishing that decision as a book took years, and it's worth naming what filled that gap. Beck spent time reflecting on and reckoning with the specific harm of what he'd built his identity around for over 2 decades, not in the abstract, but in concrete terms, revisiting specific relationships and specific acts of manipulation and violence he would later put directly on the page. Writing the book wasn't simply a career change, it was the mechanism through which he processed what leaving actually meant, which is part of why the finished work reads less like a polished memoir and more like an unflinching confession written by someone who needed to actually say all of it. The publisher that picked him up, Holloway House, had placed a specific ad looking for Black writers willing to write about the actual Black experience rather than a more polished or literary version of it. Robert Beck, dropping off his manuscript, left behind a pair of sunglasses that an editor noticed and remembered, a small human detail from the exact moment his second life began. It's worth understanding what Holloway House actually was at that moment, because the relationship that would later exploit him began as something closer to a genuine opportunity. The publishing industry in the mid-1960s offered almost no serious pathway for a formerly incarcerated Black man in his late 40s, with no formal writing credentials, to publish anything at all, let alone a manuscript this unflinching about his own criminal history. Holloway House was, at the time, one of the only publishers willing to take that risk. That's part of what makes the later years of the relationship so difficult to sit with. The same publisher who gave him his one real shot at a legitimate second act is the same one his family later described as leaving him uninformed about his own book's continued success, decades after that initial opportunity had turned into his entire livelihood. The book held nothing back, no softened language, no distance from the violence and manipulation he'd participated in for over 2 decades. Reviews were mixed and sometimes hostile. It sold anyway, and by 1973, 6 years after publication, it had been reprinted 19 times and sold nearly 2 million copies. That commercial success happened almost entirely without mainstream literary validation. The major review outlets of the era weren't equipped to know what to do with a book like this, a first-person account of pimping, told without moral framing or an obvious redemption arc for most of its length, selling not because critics championed it, but because word spread directly through the communities it was actually written for and about. That's a genuinely different path to bestseller status than most books in this era took, and it's part of why his influence ended up running so much deeper in street culture and eventually hip-hop than in conventional literary circles. Here's where this stops being a story about one man's book and becomes a story about an entire American art form. Iceberg Slim's writing style, direct, unflinching, delivered in the specific cadence and vocabulary of the streets he came from, refusing to translate that voice into something more palatable for a wider audience, became a direct influence on writers, filmmakers, and musicians across the following decades. Scottish novelist Irvine Welsh has described him as one of the most dominant literary voices since Shakespeare in terms of cultural reach through music and film specifically. The clearest, most direct proof of that influence has two names, Ice-T and Ice Cube. Two of hip-hop's most significant and enduring artists, both took stage names directly derived from Iceberg Slim's own name, an acknowledgement, permanent and public, of exactly where the persona and the voice came from. Both artists have spoken about this influence beyond just the name itself. The specific narrative voice Iceberg Slim pioneered, first person, unflinching, refusing to explain or translate street vocabulary for an outside audience, became close to a template for an entire lyrical tradition in hip-hop that followed. Before Iceberg Slim, there wasn't really a commercially successful literary model for that voice existing in print, aimed at a black readership, without an editor's hand visibly softening it. He proved that voice could sell in the millions. Everyone who came after inherited that proof, whether or not they'd ever read a page of his actual writing. His 1972 novel, Trick Baby, was adapted into an actual film that same year, a real production, not a loosely claimed inspiration, part of the Blaxploitation film wave of the era. Between the books themselves, the direct naming influence on two of hip-hop's most important artists, and a real film adaptation, Iceberg Slim's fingerprints are on more of modern black popular culture than most people who've never read him would ever guess. Consider the actual scale of what two stage names built on his legacy went on to accomplish. Ice-T became one of the founding voices of West Coast gangsta rap and later built an entirely separate career as a mainstream television actor. Ice Cube co-founded NWA, one of the most influential groups in hip-hop history, before building his own career as a solo artist, actor, and filmmaker spanning decades. Two artists who, between them, helped define an entire genre's and aesthetic for the following 30 years, both chose to carry a dead pimp turned author's name as their permanent public identity. That's not a passing homage. That's a direct, lifelong acknowledgement of where the foundation came from. What happened to Robert Beck personally, while all of this cultural influence was spreading outward without him, is the part of this story that almost never gets told alongside the rest of it. Stay with me. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the real people behind the culture, not just the legend, subscribe. That's the whole channel. Now, what actually happened to the man himself? Despite selling millions of books and reshaping an entire cultural voice, Robert Beck did not become wealthy from his writing. By his daughter Misty's later account, his relationship with his publisher, Bentley Morris at Holloway House, left him believing his books had stopped selling, told, in her account, that there simply wasn't an audience left for his work anymore. That wasn't true. His books kept selling. He just wasn't the one seeing the money from it. This is where the story crosses from a personal tragedy into something closer to the institutional pattern this channel keeps finding underneath different names. A publishing arrangement negotiated decades earlier by a young writer with no leverage and no other options, locked him into terms that let his work keep generating money for someone else long after he'd lost any real ability to renegotiate. He wasn't cheated in one dramatic moment. He was slowly outpaced by a business relationship that never had to update itself to reflect how much his work actually mattered, because the man who wrote it had no power left to demand that it should. By the end of his life, Beck was living in a one-room apartment in the middle of gang territory in Los Angeles with barely functioning plumbing. He was on dialysis, and according to his daughter, regularly had to ask his own publisher to help cover the cost of it. His final royalty check, by her account, was for $638, barely enough to cover a month's rent. This detail should sit uncomfortably because it's supposed to. A man whose name two major hip-hop artists chose to carry permanently, whose prose influenced writers across generations, was dying broke and asking his own publisher for help affording dialysis treatment. It's worth naming the broader pattern this fits into because it's not unique to him. Black artists working with independent or exploitative publishing arrangements in this era frequently signed contracts with terms weighted heavily toward the publisher, with little legal recourse once the work started generating real revenue. Beck's specific situation, a best-selling author who died unable to reliably afford his own medical treatment, is an extreme version of a pattern that repeated across the careers of many writers and musicians from the same period, most of whom never got even the posthumous recognition his work eventually received. Robert Beck died on April 28, 1992, from complications of liver failure and long-term illness. He was 73 years old. He died the same week the Rodney King verdict set off the Los Angeles riots, an eruption of unrest across the exact city where he'd spent his final impoverished years. With the city's attention entirely consumed by what was happening in the streets, word of his death didn't reach most of the public for weeks. A man whose influence had already reshaped an entire genre of American music died, and the culture he'd helped build didn't find out until the smoke had cleared. There's a genuine, almost unbearable irony in that timing worth sitting with directly. Beck spent his entire literary career writing in unflinching detail about the exact conditions of poverty, institutional neglect, and systemic disregard that would erupt into national news the very week he died. He didn't live to see the world's attention turn, again, toward the same kinds of pressures he'd spent his life documenting from the inside. He simply died in the middle of it, unnoticed, one more casualty of the same conditions his books had already tried to explain to anyone willing to actually read them. So here's the actual shape of this story. Robert Beck spent 24 years causing real harm as a pimp. That part of his life doesn't get softened or explained away by what came after. Then, he spent the second half of his life writing that experience down with a level of honesty that made him the best-selling Black author in America, directly shaped the voice and vocabulary two of hip-hop's most important artists chose to build their entire careers around, and never saw the financial reward that influence should have earned him. In the years since his death, that reassessment has continued in ways he never lived to see. Justin Gifford's biography, Street Poison, published decades after Beck's death, did the kind of rigorous documentary work that finally treated his life as a serious subject of historical record rather than pulp mythology, interviewing surviving family, tracing the actual publishing contracts, and placing his influence in a documented lineage running through Blaxploitation cinema and directly into hip-hop's own origin story. That kind of retrospective attention is exactly the kind of institutional recognition that could have changed the terms of his final years had it arrived 40 years earlier instead of after his death. Ice-T and Ice Cube didn't just take a cool-sounding name. They named themselves, publicly and permanently, after a man who died broke on dialysis in an apartment with barely running water, and the world was too busy watching a city burn to notice he was gone. That's the real story behind two names you already knew, and probably never knew the rest of. If you want more of this, The real people behind the culture, not just the legend. The rest of the channel is right there.